Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the talk, and also thank you, Open UK, for giving me opportunity to speak to you from this side of the podium. And thank you, Sal, for running the security track so smoothly. I'm loving all the talks. So my name is Rao Lakkakula. I'm a head of product security or executive director in JPMorgan Chase. My focus has been securing the developer platforms in JPMorgan Chase, and also making sure application development is secure by default. That's been my focus for the last 4 years. And today I'm going to talk about supply chain security from enterprise perspective. Supply chain security is a very broad, huge topic, so there's no way I'm going to cover it in 30 minutes. So the way I'm going to approach this is go over as more of a primer on software supply chain security, touch on some of the important points, and then maybe give an opportunity for you to kind of explore further. And I have my contact details in the end, so we could go in details later. So first of all, why does software supply chain security actually matters? I think it's probably obvious by this time. You've seen so many presentations, but I have to have an obligatory log4shell deck, right? So I have this nice slide with log4shell, the spring4shell, and few of the things. So I'm not going to go into each of the individual incident. That would be a bit boring here. You could find that from any of your favorite browser, searching it. But I'm going to look this from a different angle, like two approaches. One, why does it important from an enterprise perspective, any of these incidents? The difference is traditionally an attack on one of the systems probably has an impact, but it's isolated to a few systems, right? You could contain them, fix it, you move forward. Then you act. But with the supply chain security, you're talking about an impact on hundreds and thousands of the systems at once. So the impact is so huge, and actually all enterprise actively put all hands on deck to deal with these issues. The Log4shell is a good example. Basically, pretty much all of our security guys lost vacation before last Christmas. And then there's another angle to look at it is, there's also the traditional enterprise security protection mechanisms are more of a perimeter-based, network-based protections, right? Like firewalls is a fundamental, our shield. With this software supply security, these are all embedded deep into your software chain. And these are actually running within your network, and sometimes actually running at a higher privilege. So these are not something you could work with the traditional security protections you do have. So that makes it a bit different beast to handle. Then there's another angle we could look into. So if you look at these attacks, right, obviously the most common one is the ones applications embed the open source software or a third-party software which has a vulnerability. But there's also a new type of attack we've seen with the SolarWinds is it's not just a vulnerable software. It's actually the malicious users get into the network of a supplier network, in this case the SolarWinds supplier, and actually they work on their build pipeline. So they injected the code inside the build pipeline. So the traditional ways of doing a checksum, verifying the vendor is secure, are we doing all the due diligence at the time of onboarding? None of them going to work. So these are new type of attacks are coming into the supply chain. That makes it a very, very important one. I think if you haven't really convinced by the time, obviously this is the slide everyone showing since the beginning of the conference. 700% increase in the attacks. But also, going further, the future is also not great either. Gartner did a research, and they're actually expecting by 2025, within like few years, pretty much half of the whole industry going to have some kind of attack experience by the time through supply chain. So what is a software supply chain in general? From an enterprise perspective, in a simple term, it's when a developer commits the code till all the way application is deployed to production, or if it is an end user product, the product is deployed to the user, right? That's the simpler case. That's the case you don't actually use any other software, any other packages. You're writing code from scratch, and you're sticking to it. But that's not the case in most cases. So the software supply chain actually involves all the supply chains coming with the dependencies you use. So you're starting with the beginning of each of the dependency, and their dependencies, and their dependencies, and their. So it's actually a chain of chains for any type of smaller to big companies and enterprises. It makes it really different. So like for the enterprises, it's not just that application supply chain. We do have multiple levels of supply chains. We do have vendor supply chain, because most of the banks like us, we use a lot of vendors. They have their own supply chain, which they're actually depending on all other suppliers, and also open source vendor software. We also have hardware supply chain, from like routers to firewalls to desktops and any other hardware. At pretty much all hardware at that one point runs a software on their hardware, right? So you're talking about the supply chain coming from that. Then we also have the whole SaaS ecosystem. There's a lot of SaaS vendors like the banks use and most enterprises use. That's a supply chain we don't have much visibility into. That includes the cloud providers, right? So you're seeing this keep going on the list, and then you add these telecom providers also have supply chain. The whole 5G equipment, 5G networks we use in the enterprise, you have to deal with it too. So if you look at that, it's like there are multiple supply chains in an enterprise. But the reason I think the open source supply chain is still important is, you all know, like most of the modern applications, 90% of the code actually comes from open source. So end of the day, you could actually say securing an open source supply chain actually helps with any other supply chain too. But in the enterprise, we have to deal with all these too. And I'll touch briefly on some of the efforts going on in this area from a public sector and also the industry-driven initiatives. This is the one slide I probably need to look at the notes, because I don't want to say something wrong and get in trouble with government folks. So this all started with 2021 presidential execution order in USA. There are a couple of them. And then most of the last year has been focused on how do we turn those executive order into more actionable guidance and documentation. So if you see Office of the Management and Budget, OMB, Office of the Security National Intelligence, OIDA, and the NIST, they all like produced a bunch of documents last year, which focusing on like providing guidance to the development of the. So the kind of interesting thing is most of these started as a federal supply chains, but there's a lot of focus on supply chain security last year, so it's actually kind of expanded beyond just the federal supply chain, and private industry is looking into it, including us, like focusing more on how do we improve our security too. And then UK is not lagging behind. I mean, UK, the 2021 government actually made a call for view on software supply chain security. That's basically kicking off the nation's cyber resiliency initiative. Then we also saw last year, this National Cybersecurity Strategy 2023 got published, and then the end of the year, the UK government issued a proposal for legislation to improve the overall UK cyber resiliency. So there's a lot of focus being there. From the industry side, obviously Brian was talking about the Open Source Security Foundation. I'm actually on the board of the Open Source Security Foundation, so I get to observe it from closely. We actually came up with a 10-stream mobilization plan last July and presented to the White House administration. Actually, I was in the room when we presented that one. There was a good focus on that. Now, also, it's not just the OpenSSF. There's other industry groups are actually looking into it. FSISAC, which is a group with financial institutions. They started a supply chain working group last year. I'm actually part of that group. And then also the CNCF actually have a tag security. They produced a software security factory reference architecture. So there's a lot of moving parts here. So this is actually a best time, if you haven't involved with any of them, to get involved and start understanding those initiatives. As the picture shows, it's actually still a steep hill to go through, so I think we all need to work together. Then what are some of the key strategies if you're looking this from an enterprise perspective, right? For that matter, actually, any company, right? It's relevant for any size. First of all, you need to understand how your development practices are done in the firm, which is actually is not that easy for a big company like us. So you have to understand there's actually internal development goes on. There's outsourced development goes on. There's actually not just the software development. There's actually development happens outside of the software also. The groups, they bring in software and they develop like a pieces of it, some kind of scripting. So you have to understand where is the software coming in. So cataloging the ingestion point is the first step. Once you identify the ingestion points, understand the process of that ingestion, and then start monitoring where the software is coming from, what vendors, what open source, and then start validating the source of that ingestion. And open source, for the open source package, we have OpenSSF scorecard. Navin gave an excellent talk yesterday. That's a good tool. For the vendor, there are some tools. You could use a bit of a static code analysis or source composition analysis tools. There are multiple vendors for that to kind of understand more about the vendor software coming in. And once you understand that, then you can start actually building controls within your build and deployment pipelines. That includes some of the scanning infrastructure you could do. Obviously, SBOM plays a good role there. But I'm not going to go into obviously this is not talk about vendors or tools or technology, but conceptually the idea is you understanding more about your software practices and where the software is there, that's the key. But that's the half of the problem. The second half is actually where that software is being deployed. So that's where having a accurate and a strong asset inventory is the key for success of the security. That includes all the open source, vendor software, desktop software, anything coming into the firm, start tracking them in this inventory. That will help you when the next log4 shell hits us, because then it's a matter of then you understand where package is deployed to where and what package is there, then you can have the patching mechanism. Having that asset inventory is a kind of key and center to the whole system. Then obviously there are multiple strategies on how do you secure your internal pipelines, right? There's a source code integrity you could do, which is securing the source code repositories. How do you manage your source committed is not corrupted? Then there's a build integrity, where you can have checks in the pipelines, making sure it's not calling external sources, like air tightening your pipelines. Then there's a build integrity of where the build artifacts are actually being signed and verified. Then there's a deployment integrity. So if you do that, your internal supply chain is secure. I mean, when we talked about the enterprise supply chain, right, there's multiple layers. Some of the strategies are common across everything. Obviously, you have to pick what works based on the processes you have. How are we doing with the time? So, okay, that's good. So let's touch a little bit on the SBOMs. Obviously, we cannot skip SBOMs in any supply chain security presentation. I mean, everyone's gonna love SBOMs. And that's actually an opportunity for me to show some cool chocolates, because it's up after the dinner talk, after the lunch talk, right? So if you look at the Cadbury Dairy Milk chocolate ingredients, so the SBOM is very similar to a food label. That's what everyone looks into to start with, right? It's milk, sugar, cocoa butter, vegetable fats, all that stuff, and couple of chemicals there, right? But in reality, the software bill of material is a bit more like this, because in reality, we don't actually have one ingredient, right? We actually bring in a lot of dependencies, and they bring in a lot of dependencies. So when you add that, it's like a box of chocolate. Maybe it's a box of chocolates. That's how the software is in any enterprise. So the list goes on and goes on. And then SBOM is basically a collection of all the software dependencies or components application has, plus the build processes and also any additional data about how the software is being built, right? So that, as you can imagine, is going to go crazy and crazy. So that's why we have few of the standards formats on how do we express the SBOM. There's a SPDX, there's a CycloneDX, There's a Swift tags, which is kind of dying down, so mostly cycle-only-X and SPDX are the standard format. But what format you use, it doesn't matter for enterprises. The key is they are kind of interoperable. Most of the cases, you have tooling to do that, but having an SBOM is more important. And then the next step is you get all these SBOMs, and you see it goes really crazy, big. How do we actually operationalize, right? We talked a bit about that asset inventory and have this vulnerability management process work with it. So SBOMs will play a major role there. So if you look at some of the supply chains enterprise I mentioned, the internal supply chain, the open source packages, you could build a SBOM, even if the open source package manager is not giving you. You could look at actually a package builder, you could intercept there and get all the dependencies. You can build a SBOM, right? That's what we do. But for a closed source like a vendor software, it's not that easy. I mean, you could use SCF to guess some of it. That's where actually having an SBOM helps. So it gives a visibility into some of these closed source and vendor products we consume. But once you have that, connecting with the asset inventory is the kind of key. Then integrate with your current vulnerability management processes. That gives you a good visibility into all the dependencies you consume, not just the software you write. And then with that, I'll try to give a bit more, try not to specific to a OpenSSF because I'm on that board. But I think which organization you join, it doesn't matter. Most of the working groups in OpenSSF are actually open. You don't need to be a member to be there. I highly advise you to start attending those working groups, involve with them, understand if it works for you, works for you. Otherwise, pick another working group, other organization. The point is, I think, start involving is more important because this is a field, start evolving more. So this is opportunity. If you want influence, bring in your case, bring in your problems, this is the best time to influencing some of those initiatives being happening. So there's a CNCF tag security group that focuses on supply chain security. OpenSSF I mentioned. We have 6 working groups. There's actually one new one started last year. It's called End User Working Group. So even though you're not a software producer, that group focusing on how do we actually as a consumer can start influencing, we need these elements in SBOM, or we need these toolings to consume SBOM. So there's an opportunity to even start influencing from as an end consumer. And there's obviously a ton of projects, Salsa, SigStore, scorecards. They're all open. Everything is on GitHub. You can start involving to understand about this. Before I close with few of the thoughts, I'd like to open up for the questions. Sally, you go last. I'll go first with me. Good.
Yes, my question is in connection with the strategy. What I realized that you mentioned at the end is the people, the consumer. Mm-hmm. But you don't think the consumer should start at the beginning? In other words, you build the strategy according what the consumer needs, and therefore build also the consumer integrated in all the process from collection, processing, etc., because at the end, the consumer are driving the process, not the software. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned a couple of consumers, right? I don't know which you're talking about, the end user consumer or consumer being the developers within the firm too. So they're both, I think in my opinion, both are consumer, right? When I said like the strategies on enterprise, right, so most of the developers as a consumer, that's how I think starting with the understanding the software development practices, how they are building the software is actually the key. So most of the processes you're actually trying to secure, understanding those practices will help. With the end user, it's a whole, I think, is a discussion about the usability versus the security there. But I think my focus been more on like supply chain security to make the security being a transparent and secure, so that I'm not considering more of the end user being in case. Correct me though if I'm going in the right direction. Are you focusing more on end users or the developers?
It's a question.
Sorry, are you focusing more on the developers or the end users being the?
I'm focusing on end user.
Yeah. End user, like the one actually using the software. Yeah. So like I think
It's not so much the software, it's the benefit of the software on the, let's say, on the process.
Yeah.
Because end user is at strategy, there is a strategical, let's say, central place.
Yeah. I mean, most of, as like these are from my examples too, right? Like, if we understand the process of the current, the development practices, embedding security makes totally makes sense, because most of the earlier approaches were we trying to make it as a shield. That never worked because of it's so much embedded there. So one thing from my personal experience is like working with the package managers, working with the ingestion process of the vendor management, third party, the departments. Those are the ones usually on the grounds doing some of these like bringing in the secure. So working with them, actually understand their pain point, their friction points, automating some of them is actually the key for success. So to your point, yes, we consider that from the beginning. Go ahead.
If a country like the UK or the US were to impose SBOMs to enterprises now, or let's say your enterprise or your company, would you be able to provide the SBOMs straight away? And if not, what would be missing? What would you need right now to be able to meet this requirement?
Yeah. So to be clear, I'm not supposed to talk about JPMC. That's how I got the legal permission to talk here. It's not talk about JPMC practices. I'll keep it a generic answer, right? Currently, it's not that straightforward, I think, generate SBOM for everything you do, right? But if you have a modern tech stack where you know like all the software being generated, the points, the package managers currently do allow you to generate the programmatically SBOM. So for the companies, I think, where they have a good handle on the development process, actually, it's a straightforward option. But I think for enterprises where actually they have maybe a different and some customary practices where then they have to do some work to generate that SBOM. But there are tooling available to do that. There are two questions there, and Sal.
Right. Sorry, quick question.
Oh, Abdullah.
Do you see challenges with transitive dependencies?
Yes. I think I briefly mentioned, right, like the SBOM for that box of chocolates itself is actually is hard to fill in a page. But when you look at any large to like a medium to large software, actually SBOM kind of really creeps out, mainly because of the transitive dependencies. So one of the evolving standard from NIST in USA is the VEX, which is the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. Actually, I do have a lot of high hopes on it. That is trying to understand whether actually a specific dependency, transitive dependency, have an impact or not, rather than we're trying to patch every transitive dependency. Because in reality, if we operationalize like as it is, I think the VM team is going to go crazy. They're going to actually not going to do it, because every minute you have a CVE to fix, which is not going to work, right? So VEX is the other one. There are few innovations happening on even understanding, go deeper into the actual call graphs to understand whether you have been using the specific transitive dependency, the part which is actually being impacted, have impact in your software. But I think there's a bit more research to be done there.
Do you think that, obviously, while SBOMs have, so to speak, taken off, do you think that has caused somewhat of a race for organizations like JPMC to themselves start consuming and in some cases producing SBOMs? But do you think that's leading to the production of incomplete SBOMs that don't tell the true picture of what it is that the application is and what they're consuming? And do you think that in some ways the SBOM actually causes a safety blanket in the sense that they think that they know what's in it when in actual fact it's actually quite far from the truth? Have you done anything in that area to understand that more and see where the problems could lie?
Yeah, I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, as I mentioned, like if you take, again, not JPMC, take any big enterprise, we have to deal with like a lot of vendors, right? Hundreds of vendors. So not all of them are ready to give SBOMs. But one of the initiatives, we're actually trying to work with the third-party vendor procurement process is actually making SBOM be one of the required elements going forward, right? It's not done yet. It's been work because obviously we had to work with the vendors that we have more control over. So part of your question is obviously, yes, we are involving with trying to get SBOMs from the vendors we use. We don't directly sell products to everyone. Obviously, we are more of consumers. So to your other part of questions, like do we able to produce SBOM? For all internal software we do have an option, but that's not that because we don't actually directly sell products to other people. I think the third part of question is like how do you validate the accuracy of SBOM? I think that was your question, right? Yeah, I mean, obviously that itself is a unsolved problem, but in my opinion, there are multiple ways we can go after, right? I think getting SBOM itself is a big improvement from the current process. The current process is actually a point-in-time due diligence we do on, hey, what is your practices? Are you good, right? And then you don't do that for next X months. So getting an SBOM at least is a dynamic way. Then second thing is obviously there are some tools you could do like a binary analysis to get a baseline of, okay, I'm seeing these and your SBOM has none of them. What's the point? Like we could even do some kind of baseline. Obviously, the binary analysis doesn't give you a full picture of a closed source, but you can at least say, like, is it close enough that it gives you, are they going in the right direction or not? I mean, again, it's a contractual, legal binding, so you have the vendor to do that. But eventually, in my personally, it's not JPMC view, I think the way we're going to solve this is some kind of a third-party validation service, not one, maybe multiple, which kind of say that attestation. So the whole attestation of the SBOMs itself is, I think, is a evolving subject.
Hey, Thomas JPMorgan. Not really a question, but more remark. For the people that have questions about SBOMs and VACs, I actually work on that. I work on the SPX security profile. I work on VACs. I actually have a talk in about 45 minutes where I actually have a demo how you can do SBOMs with open source tooling, and also how I actually left out some of the technical details that are now being asked about SBOM validation and all that stuff. But people ask about adoption. There's actually under LF open source tooling being developed, actually originally developed by German Automotive that are really a little bit in front. So there is actually open source tooling to generate SBOMs to do all of that work already out there. It's just probably unknown. So if people are interested in that, you can ask me things now. You can also see my talk in 45 minutes.
I was about to say all SBOM questions. Actually, Thomas going to give a talk in half an hour. Back to Sal.
So what you're describing for your SBOM practices is pretty genuinely best practice, right? Verify it, sign it, do it with your CI/CD so that you're not missing anything to the best of your ability. But let's reflect a little bit on this idea that it's several different chocolates in the box. And unfortunately, when I was doing Security Slam a few months ago, inside of CNCF, there was only a single project out of 128 that even had an SBOM when we started that. A couple more do now, but not a single open source project has a fully automated way to deliver their SBOMs. So at this time, making sure that we get that problem fixed and making sure that it's not just a massive amount of regulation-driven developer toil would be really nice. The one other aspect of this is that you've got like the perfect use case and architecture for the way that like SPDX has been designed for right now. It's been designed for cloud systems. Now, I have made a bunch of new friends because we all try to build our own SBOMs for industries outside of that, and we can't. And so we're all bonding together over the developer deficit of good documentation around this. And specifically for anything ranging from like single board computers to what I do, which is AI ML pipelines, we've not built that out yet. And that's just a major concern for me.
Yeah. I think that's where probably Thomas Stock will answer some of it, go into deep it. But I mean, SBOM, when NTIA proposed 2 years back, I think even they were trying to figure out what this is the minimal element we actually need in SBOM, right? So it's only 2-year-old, so it's a very new, it's actually a very evolving form. But we all know that it's important, gives a good visibility. It is a kind of foundation for our trying to get inventory all our dependencies. But again, I think it's an area I think we all need to actually start contributing because there's so much to be done. That's the reason we're trying to form, actually working with the NTA and government on financial sector SBOM pilot to say, hey, what are the additional elements we need from a financial sector rather than just depending on general SBOM too. So because energy sector is doing in USA, I would highly encourage, like, is there any sector like you're part of, like maybe there's additional stuff you need. This is a good time to be involved. Got time? All right, let's do the closing thoughts. The sad truth is there is no magic switch to make the supply chain security secure. Also, there is no single vendor, whoever is claimed to be, to solve this problem, right? The only way to do is you need to understand more about your software development practices. You need to more understand where the software is coming into the form, where it is going. Having that good understanding is the only way. And then on top of it, SBOM, use these great projects, open source projects coming there. Then that's the only way we could get to a position where maybe at least we can have some sleep when the next Log4 shell hits us. So good luck. Thank you.